I have money, not enough to quit my job and disappear, but not so little that I have to stand in a supermarket debating whether I can afford eggs or milk, and then end up choosing instant noodles because they somehow solve both problems. In a surprisingly creative way, it is that very dangerous middle, the kind where you start thinking, maybe I should buy something. And if you really think about it, that is not strange at all. The entire economy runs on the idea that you earn money and then spend it. Ideally, spend it quickly. Because if you do not, you start feeling like you are living the wrong way, like everyone around you is upgrading their life, while you're still wearing a shirt from 2018 and calling it minimalism. But in the past few years, something has shifted. After COVID, there was a moment when inflation in the United States reached 1%, and that is not the kind of number you read and nod at like someone who understands the world. It is the kind where you walk into a supermarket with a clear budget in your head, then stand at the checkout, staring at the screen, a little longer than usual, slowly going through each item, as if the cashier quietly added an online course you never signed up for. Rent goes up, gas goes up. Everything you cannot avoid paying suddenly decides to cost more. Meanwhile, salaries also go up, a little over 4%. It sounds reasonable, but when everything else rises at twice that speed, it does not feel like you are earning more. It feels like you are playing a game where the rules have just been updated and no one told you. There was also a brief, beautiful period when people managed to save a lot during the pandemic. At one point over 30%, it was the first time you looked at your bank account and thought, so this is what it feels like to have a financial plan. And then, very quietly, that number drifted back down to around 4 to 5%. You did not lose money in some dramatic way. It just faded, little by little, through perfectly reasonable things. And when that sense of having extra starts to disappear, you do not panic. You just adjust. You cannot control housing prices or interest rates, but you can control what you choose to buy today. And that control becomes important when bigger forces start to feel unpredictable. So buying something is no longer just spending money. It becomes a way to remind yourself that at least one part of your life is still under your control. And that is where it begins. I see a shirt. It is not the kind of thing that screams, buy this now or your life will fall apart. It is just fine, nice to have, not necessary, but it is on sale. And this is where things get a little dangerous in a very reasonable way, because your brain immediately shifts from asking, do I need this, to something completely different. If I do not buy it, am I losing money? It is fascinating logic. Somehow, spending money becomes an act of saving. Add a voucher on top of that, and suddenly, you are not spending anymore. You are optimizing your finances. I remember once buying a shirt just because it was 40% off, and I genuinely felt like I had made money until I got home and realized I did not own a single pair of pants that matched it. And instead of concluding that maybe I did not need the shirt, I arrived at a much more reasonable conclusion. I needed new pants, and those new pants, quite conveniently, worked best with brown shoes. You can probably guess what happened next. At some point, you are no longer buying an item. You are building a version of yourself, a version that looks more put together, more in control, more like someone who knows what they are doing, and most importantly, someone who seems to have a plan. That feeling is real, at least for the first 10 minutes. And the interesting part is, you never think you are doing anything wrong, because if you look at each step individually, everything makes sense. You are not being reckless. You are just adjusting, upgrading, optimizing. It sounds like a very serious personal project, until one evening, you open your banking app just to check how much money you have left for the weekend. And you stare at the number a little longer than usual, not because it is terrible, but because it is not what you remember. So you scroll through your transaction history like a very unmotivated detective. What was this? Oh, right. That was on sale. And this one, also on sale. The more you look, the more everything makes sense in a slightly uncomfortable way, because none of the purchases look stupid. Each one has a reason. Each one has context. And that is exactly why the sum of all those reasonable decisions leads to a result you never consciously chose on a larger scale. This is not just your story. Total household debt in the United States is now around $8 trillion. And no one wakes up thinking, today I will contribute to that number. It is simply many people, on many ordinary days, making decisions that feel completely reasonable at the time. And while you're putting things off, money does not stand still. With interest rates around 5 to 3, 75%, it works quietly. It does not bother you every day, but it does not forget its job either. And by the time you really notice, the number is already a little different from what it used to be. And that little difference, repeated enough times, stops being small. The most ironic part of all this is that if you go back to each individual moment, you will not find a single decision bad enough to blame yourself for everything made sense when it happened. And that is exactly why you never stop to ask one very simple question. What am I actually paying for? And that question may sound simple, but it is surprisingly hard to answer honestly. Because if you say you are paying for an item, technically that is true. You have a new shirt, a new pair of shoes, a few things that look pretty good on the surface. But if you pause a little longer, you begin to realize that what you actually bought is not sitting in your closet. It lives in that very brief feeling when you try it on and think, yeah, this actually looks pretty good. And that feeling, to be fair, it does feel worth the money, at least in that moment. The only problem is, it does not stay. As long as you expect, but the payment you owe is very patient. And not just patient, it also has a better memory than you do. Because you might forget what you bought on some random evening when you were a bit tired, but the system does not forget. It keeps reminding you of that decision, steadily and very politely. And there's a slightly uncomfortable question, but one worth thinking about. If you could go back to that exact moment, the moment you saw the discount, the voucher, and felt like you deserved it, were you really choosing, or were you just following a flow that anyone in that situation would follow? And if it is the second, then maybe what matters is not how much money you spent, but how many times in your life you actually paused long enough to notice what you were choosing before it was already chosen for you. And usually, you do not sit there long enough to think deeply about that question, because honestly, no one opens their banking app in search of enlightenment. You just want to check if you still have enough money for the weekend. And if the answer is still okay, everything continues as usual. You close the app, switch to something lighter, and that slightly uneasy feeling from a moment ago fades away in a very convenient way until the next time, and the next time is usually not very different from the last. Still a fairly ordinary evening, still a number that makes you pause just a little longer, still a list of transactions, each with its own reasonable explanation, and you scroll through them as if you are reading a past version of yourself, a version that in every moment felt logical, convincing, and completely sure of what it was doing. It is just that this version is not the one paying now. And this is where things start to become a little interesting, because you begin to notice a small but meaningful gap between those two versions of you. One is you at the moment of decision, confident, rational, with vouchers, discounts, and very clear reasons. The other is you at the moment of payment, calmer, less excited, and starting to see things a bit more realistically. And technically, they are the same person, but they are not exactly the same. One chases the feeling, the other deals with the consequences. And the funny thing is, those two versions almost never meet, because when one shows up, the other is usually already gone. So the whole system runs quite smoothly. You decide in a good state, you pay in a slightly less good one. And because those two states do not overlap, you never fully feel the weight of the decision. At the same time, that is why everything feels lighter when you press buy until it no longer does. And even then, you do not go back to fix each individual decision, because none of them are obviously wrong enough for you to point at and say, this is the problem. Everything made sense at the time it happened. And because of that, the only way to change is not to find a wrong decision, but to start recognizing the pattern behind all those reasonable ones. Like the next time you see something on sale and your mind starts running that familiar script again. From this looks good, to it would be a waste not to buy, to I deserve this. You may not need to do anything drastic. You can still buy it or not, but at least you might recognize that you have been down this road before, and where it led you last time